An Amish man bids on a virgin bride. But when the stagecoach door swings open, it isn't a young girl stepping down. It's a gray-haired woman with nothing but a Bible and a worn carpetbag. The snow's falling hard, and every whisper in town says he's made a fool of himself. But when he lets her inside to escape the storm, something shifts in that lonely cabin. Because this woman carries more than sorrow. She carries faith, secrets, and a quiet strength that could melt even a frozen heart. As rumors spread and his church turns against him, he must choose, protect his reputation, or protect the stranger who's teaching him what love really means. But who is she, truly? Why did she come to his door on the very night he prayed for a wife? And when the truth finally breaks, will mercy be enough to save them both? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The bitter autumn wind whipped across the Colorado foothills, cutting through Isaac Stoltzfus's plain black coat as he moved among his livestock. The beasts huddled close together, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Isaac's weathered hands worked methodically, checking each animal with practiced care. His eyes drifted to the barn, its weathered boards still bearing the dark scars of that terrible night 3 years ago. The sight of those burn marks never failed to twist something deep in his chest. He quickly looked away, focusing instead on a young calf that needed attention. "The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away," he whispered, the words carried away by the wind. But lately those words brought little comfort. Each evening he read his Bible by lamplight, seeking answers in the familiar verses, yet feeling more alone than ever. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention. Harvey Dunn, his English neighbor, rode up on his bay mare, the horse's flanks steaming in the cold air. Harvey's ruddy face broke into a familiar grin beneath his broad-brimmed hat. "Morning, Isaac. Still living like a hermit, I see," Harvey called out, dismounting with a grunt. He patted his horse's neck and walked over to where Isaac stood. Isaac nodded politely. "Harvey." He continued his work, checking the wooden fence that needed mending before winter set in. "This place needs a woman's touch," Harvey said, not for the first time. "Can't keep going on alone like this." Isaac's hands stilled on the fence post. "The Lord provides what he wills." "Maybe the Lord expects you to do some providing for yourself," Harvey replied, pulling something from his coat pocket. "Come on inside. Got something to show you." Reluctantly, Isaac followed Harvey into his modest cabin. The interior was neat but spare. A pot of coffee on the iron stove, a simple wooden table, a narrow cot with a quilt folded at its foot. Harvey settled himself at the table, while Isaac put on fresh coffee. "Look here," Harvey said, smoothing out a newspaper on the wooden surface. His finger jabbed at a small advertisement. "Mail-order bride service in Denver. Proper Christian women looking for honest men. Why not give it a try?" Isaac set 2 tin cups of coffee on the table, frowning. "That's not our way. We don't gamble with matters of the heart." "Sometimes faith rides on risk, friend." Harvey took a long sip of coffee. "Remember Abraham? The Lord told him to pack up and go, not knowing where. Sometimes we got to take that first step. Trust the path will appear." Isaac said nothing, but his eyes kept returning to that small square of newsprint. After Harvey left, he sat alone in the gathering darkness, watching shadows dance on the cabin walls. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional lowing of cattle and the lonely call of a coyote in the distance. That night, Isaac knelt beside his cot, clasping his calloused hands together. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I need your direction. Show me the way." The wind whistled through the cabin's chinks, and somewhere in that sound, Isaac felt something shift in his heart. With trembling fingers, he lit the lamp and took out his writing materials. The paper was slightly yellowed, saved for important letters to his family back in Lancaster County. For a long while, he sat there, pen poised above the page. What could he say? How could he explain who he was, what he wanted? Finally, the words began to flow, careful and measured. I am seeking a virtuous, God-fearing young woman willing to help rebuild a home from ashes. He wrote of his faith, his land, his hope for a family blessed by the Lord. He did not mention the fire or his losses. Those were burdens he wasn't ready to share. The next morning, Isaac hitched his horse to the wagon before dawn. The sky was just beginning to lighten as he drove the rutted road toward town, the precious letter tucked safely in his coat pocket. Each jolt of the wagon made him question his decision, but he forced himself to continue. At the post office, he stood for several minutes with the letter in his hand, watching the early morning sun streak through the dusty windows. The postmaster waited patiently, used to Isaac's deliberate ways. Finally, Isaac placed the letter on the counter, along with the required postage. As he drove home, the rising sun cast long shadows across the frosted grass. For the first time in years, Isaac felt something stir in his heart. Not joy, exactly, but perhaps the faintest glimmer of hope, like the first pale light of dawn after a long, dark night. 2 weeks after sending his letter, Isaac found an envelope waiting at the post office, sealed with a distinctive red wax stamp bearing the letters CMA. His hands trembled slightly as he carried it back to his wagon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt street as townspeople began their daily routines, but Isaac barely noticed them. He waited until he was home, seated at his kitchen table, before carefully breaking the seal. The agency's letterhead was crisp and professional, announcing their successful match with Miss Clara Mayfield, age 21. Included was a brief note in delicate handwriting that made Isaac's weather-worn cheeks flush with color. Dear Mr. Stoltzfus, the letter began, I find great joy in simple things, the rhythm of household tasks, the satisfaction of fresh-baked bread, and quiet evenings with God's Word. I look forward to sharing in the work of your homestead, should you find me suitable. The careful penmanship spoke of someone who took pride in doing things properly. Isaac read the letter 3 times before setting it down. That evening, he penned his reply along with the required deposit, his usually steady hand betraying his nervousness as he wrote. The following days fell into a pattern of preparation. Isaac threw himself into readying the homestead, as if physical labor could calm his racing thoughts. He mended the split-rail fences that marked his property line, the rhythmic swing of his hammer echoing across the prairie. The cattle needed tending, and he meticulously checked each one, ensuring they were healthy before winter set in. Inside the cabin, Isaac cleaned until every surface gleamed. He prepared the spare room with fresh linens he'd ordered from back east, smoothing each wrinkle with careful hands. The simple bed frame he'd crafted himself gleamed with fresh polish. Harvey rode by frequently, unable to resist teasing his friend. "How's the postal courtship coming along?" he called out one afternoon, leaning on his saddle horn with a broad grin. "Never thought I'd see the day. Straight-laced Isaac Stoltzfus wooing by mail." Isaac just shook his head, a slight smile touching his lips. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, friend." When supplies ran low, Isaac made his way to town, his wagon rattling down the rutted road to Mrs. Halverson's general store. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle. Mrs. Halverson stood behind the counter, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of his appearance as he gathered his items: flour, seeds for spring planting, and a few other necessities. "You sending for a bride, Isaac?" she asked directly as she totaled his purchases. Her tone was curious rather than condemning. Isaac's hand stilled on the counter. He could feel heat rising in his face, but forced himself to meet her gaze. "Yeah, I am." Mrs. Halverson nodded thoughtfully. "Well, it's about time. Not good for a man to be alone." She wrapped his purchases in brown paper with efficient movements. As Isaac loaded his wagon, he could hear whispers from a group gathered outside the barber shop. But he held his chin high, remembering his father's words about living right in God's eyes, not man's. The wagon wheels left deep tracks in the dirt as he headed home, dark snow clouds gathering over the distant ridge. The next day brought a telegram delivered by Harvey, who'd been in town. "Thought you'd want this right away," he said, holding out the yellow paper. Isaac's fingers were stiff with cold as he unfolded the message. Bride arriving via Fort Collins stage, December 3rd. 7 words that changed everything. Isaac stood in his doorway long after Harvey had ridden away, watching the snow clouds build over the mountains. The wind carried the promise of winter, but for the first time in years, the cold didn't seem to reach his heart. That evening, as Isaac lit his lamp against the gathering darkness, he found himself humming an old hymn his mother used to sing. The melody filled the cabin's silence with something that felt like hope. He opened his Bible to Psalm 23, the familiar words taking on new meaning. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The next morning, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Isaac noticed shoots of green poking through the soil near his cabin, winter wheat he'd planted weeks ago, refusing to give up despite the late season. He stood looking at those tiny sprouts, marveling at their persistence. Like those determined plants, something new was taking root in his life, pushing up through years of grief toward the light. Snow danced in the bitter December wind as Isaac stood near Fort Collins Depot, his hat clutched respectfully in his weathered hands. His heart thundered against his ribs while he watched the approaching stagecoach, its wheels creaking through fresh powder. Around him, other townspeople hurried past, collars turned up against the growing storm. The stage's brake chains rattled as it came to a stop, steam rising from the horse's flanks. Isaac's fingers tightened on his hat brim. After weeks of preparation and prayer, he would finally meet Miss Clara Mayfield. He had rehearsed his greeting 100 times, determined to make a proper first impression. The door swung open with a groan. Instead of the young woman he expected, a gray-haired passenger emerged slowly, gripping the handrail with trembling fingers. Her black wool coat was thin for Colorado winter, and her face showed the wear of long travel. Deep lines creased the corners of her mouth and eyes, speaking of both sorrow and laughter. She looked around uncertainly before her gaze settled on Isaac. "Mr. Stoltzfus?" Her voice was soft but clear, like distant church bells. Isaac's throat went dry. "Yeah," he managed, then cleared his throat. "I am Isaac Stoltzfus. I'm Hannah Tuttle." She attempted a smile, though her lips were chapped from the cold. "From the Colorado Matrimonial Agency." Isaac's frown deepened as he glanced at the stage driver, who was already unloading bags. "There must be some mistake. I was expecting someone else." The driver shrugged, hefting down a worn carpet bag. "She's the only passenger I got for this address, mister." Hannah's gloved hands twisted together. "The agency. They made an error with the paperwork. Mixed up the names somehow." She spoke carefully, as if each word cost her something. "I know I'm not what you were expecting. I had hoped perhaps there might be work as a housekeeper. I've experience with that, and midwifery too." Her voice grew smaller. "I had nowhere else to go." Isaac stood frozen, his mind spinning like the snowflakes around them. This woman was easily 60 years old, not the young bride he'd been promised. Yet something in her bearing, The quiet dignity, despite her obvious exhaustion, spoke to him. "The inn's full up," the driver called out, already climbing back to his seat. "Big cattle sale brought folks in, plus this storm's stranding travelers." He snapped the reins, and the stage rolled away, leaving them alone in the swirling snow. Isaac watched Hannah shiver in her thin coat. The right thing to do warred with his disappointment and confusion. He thought of his warm barn, where even the livestock had shelter from the storm. What would his late wife say if he left this woman to fend for herself? "The wagon's this way," he said finally, picking up her carpet bag. "Storm's getting worse. We should go before the road gets too bad." Relief flooded Hannah's tired face. "Thank you, Mr. Stoltzfus. I'm much obliged." Isaac helped her climb onto the wagon seat, tucking a spare blanket around her shoulders before taking up the reins. The wind howled across the open ground as they left town, driving fingers of cold through every layer of clothing. Neither spoke as the horses plodded through deepening snow, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Hannah sat straight despite her weariness, hands folded in her lap, watching the white landscape pass. Isaac stole glances at her profile, noting the strength in her jaw, the way she faced the wind without complaint. She was nothing like what he'd planned for, yet there was something about her that reminded him of his mother, the same quiet endurance that had seen their family through hard times back in Pennsylvania. The scorch marks on his barn came into view through the curtain of snow. Isaac felt Hannah's questioning glance, but couldn't bring himself to explain. Not yet. The wound was still too raw, even after 3 years. They passed through his gate in silence, the wagon wheels leaving deep tracks in the virgin snow. The horses' hooves crunched on frozen ground as they approached the cabin. Isaac could see smoke rising from the chimney where he'd banked the morning's fire. The weathered logs and small windows looked humble indeed for bringing home a bride, even if she wasn't truly to be his bride at all. But as he helped Hannah down from the wagon, he noticed her looking at his home, not with disappointment, but with something like appreciation. Her eyes took in the neat woodpile, the swept porch, the carefully maintained order of everything. "You've kept things well, Mr. Stoltzfus," she said softly, and somehow those simple words eased something in his chest he hadn't known was tight. The wind picked up, driving the snow harder. They hurried toward the cabin's shelter, leaving their footprints in the gathering white, his steady and sure, hers smaller but just as determined, side by side in the deepening storm. The blizzard descended in full fury that night, howling around the cabin's eaves like a hungry wolf. Inside, Isaac knelt before the iron stove, carefully feeding split logs into its belly while stealing glances at his unexpected guest. Hannah had settled herself at the kitchen table, her capable hands steadily peeling potatoes by lamplight. The soft scrape of the knife against skin filled the awkward silence between them. "The guest room is prepared," Isaac said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "You should take it." Hannah's hands stilled. "Mr. Stoltzfus, I don't want to impose. The floor by the stove would be—" "Nay." Isaac straightened, his tone gentle but firm. "It wouldn't be right. The room is yours." She nodded, accepting his decision with quiet grace. The potato peelings curled like ribbons on the table as she worked, her movements precise and practiced. Isaac noticed she hummed softly to herself, old hymns he recognized from his childhood, though her Methodist variations differed slightly from his Amish ones. Morning brought a transformed world. Snowdrifts rose like white mountains against the fences, smoothing the landscape into gentle curves. Isaac woke to the scent of coffee and cornmeal cooking on the stove. Hannah stood at the hearth, stirring the pot with one hand while she hummed "Amazing Grace" under her breath. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, her dress simple but clean. Isaac sat at the table, acutely aware of how strange it felt having a woman in his kitchen again. Words seemed to stick in his throat. He nodded his thanks when she set a steaming bowl before him, then bent his head in silent prayer. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the morning quiet. Isaac recognized Harvey's distinctive whistle before his neighbor appeared at the window, snow crusting his heavy coat. Harvey stomped onto the porch, bringing a swirl of cold air as he entered. His eyes widened at the sight of Hannah. A broad grin split his weathered face as he looked between them. "Well now, Isaac, this your virgin bride from the agency?" He burst into hearty laughter. "Reckon they sent you a surprise package." Isaac felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Harvey," he said sharply, shooting his friend a warning glare. Hannah kept her eyes lowered, her hands folded in her lap. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Harvey cleared his throat. "Meant no offense, ma'am," he said more softly. "Just wasn't expecting—" "Well, storm's going to keep up another day at least. You folks need anything?" "We're provided for," Isaac answered stiffly. "Danke." After Harvey left, Hannah remained at the table, her fingers tracing the wood grain. "Mr. Stoltzfus," she said finally, "I want to thank you for not turning me away when I arrived." "Most would have." Isaac studied her lined face, seeing the weight of years and sorrows there. "What did your letter to the agency say?" he asked. "I wrote asking for honest labor," she replied. "Housekeeping, midwifery, work I know well. Never mentioned marriage." She sighed. "Someone must have filed it wrong. By the time I realized the mistake, I'd spent my savings on the stage ticket." The fire crackled in the stove as Isaac absorbed this. His disappointment about the young bride he'd hoped for still ached, but watching Hannah's quiet dignity in the face of Harvey's mockery had stirred something else in him: compassion and a grudging respect. They shared a simple supper of potato soup and cornbread. Hannah's cooking was plain but good, reminding Isaac of his mother's kitchen. As she cleared the dishes, she spoke softly about her years of experience keeping house for others, her tone matter-of-fact rather than complaining. When evening came, Hannah knelt beside her bed in the guest room. Isaac, passing in the hallway, paused at the sound of her voice raised in prayer. "Lord," she said clearly, "watch over this household. Bring healing to Mr. Stoltzfus's heart and keep him safe in his labors. Thank you for providing shelter from the storm. Amen." Isaac stood frozen, something catching in his chest at her simple words. She hadn't prayed for herself, only for him. He moved quietly away, thinking of how she'd faced Harvey's teasing with grace, how she worked without complaint, how her hymns filled the empty corners of his home. Perhaps, he thought as he banked the fire for the night, God's answers didn't always come in the packages we expected. Sometimes they arrived in weathered wrapping, bearing gifts of wisdom rather than youth, of understanding rather than beauty. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside, the cabin felt warmer than it had in years. 3 days passed before the snow finally surrendered to warmer winds, melting into dirty gray slush that pooled around the fence posts. Isaac's wagon wheels cut deep ruts in the softening earth as he made his way into Fort Collins for supplies, the leather reins cool and damp in his hands. The general store's bell chimed as he entered. Mrs. Halverson's eyebrows shot up at the sight of him, and she leaned forward over the counter. "Hear tell you got yourself a surprise in that mail-order bride, Isaac Stoltzfus," she said, measuring out his flour with unusual slowness. "Thompson's boy who delivers mail says she's old enough to be your mother." Isaac kept his face carefully blank, counting out coins onto the worn wooden counter. "We need coffee and salt too, if you please." Behind him, the blacksmith's familiar laugh boomed through the store. Well, if it ain't the man with the old bride in the Amish house. Martin Wheeler wiped his sooty hands on his leather apron. Never thought you plain folk went in for such peculiar arrangements. Heat crept up Isaac's neck, but he said nothing, gathering his purchases with steady hands. The whispers followed him down the street, darting between shop fronts like sparrows. By the time he loaded his wagon, his shoulders felt heavy with the weight of so many watching eyes. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. Isaac was checking the chicken coop when he heard horses approaching. His heart sank at the sight of 3 familiar figures. Bishop Abram Zook, astride his bay mare, flanked by 2 community elders on their dark geldings. Hannah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at the stern-faced visitors and quietly withdrew inside. But Isaac knew she would hear every word through the cabin's thin walls. "Brother Stoltzfus," Bishop Zook's deep voice carried across the yard, "we have come seeking truth about this situation in your home." Isaac straightened his shoulders. "Ja, Bishop, I will tell it plain." The men dismounted, and Isaac explained everything: the agency's mistake, the blizzard, Hannah's circumstances. Through it all, Bishop Zook's face remained as unyielding as winter stone. "This cannot stand," the bishop declared finally. "A single woman not of our faith living under your roof. The community talks, Brother Stoltzfus. The English already mock our ways. This brings impropriety to all of us." One of the elders, Brother Yoder, stepped forward. "If you continue to harbor this woman, we must consider shunning. Think of your immortal soul, Isaac." The threat hung in the crisp morning air. Inside the cabin, something clattered. A pan, perhaps, or a dropped spoon. Isaac thought of Hannah's quiet prayers each night, her careful mending of his clothes, the way she hummed hymns while working. The peace she had brought back to his home, different from what he had lost, but precious in its own way. The cabin door creaked open. Hannah stepped out, her gray hair neat beneath her cap, her worn dress clean and pressed. "Mr. Stoltzfus," she said softly, "I thank you for your Christian charity, but I cannot be the cause of your separation from your people. I will gather my things." Isaac looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dignity in her bearing, the knowledge of hard years in the lines around her eyes, the trembling she tried to hide in her clasped hands. He thought of her out on the roads alone, trying to find work at her age, facing the cruel judgment of strangers. "Nay," he said firmly, turning back to the bishop, "I cannot cast her out. The good book teaches us to shelter the stranger and protect the vulnerable. Would you have me do less?" Bishop Zook's face darkened. "You risk much, Brother Stoltzfus." "I risk more before God if I turn away one who needs help," Isaac answered quietly. The bishop and elders exchanged grave looks before mounting their horses. "We will pray on this matter," Bishop Zook said heavily. "But prepare your heart for discipline, Isaac." That evening, tension filled the small cabin, like smoke. Isaac sat in his chair by the fire, Bible open on his lap, but his eyes kept straying to where Hannah worked in the lamp's golden circle. Her needle moved steadily through the worn fabric of his shirt sleeve, mending a tear from fence work. The familiar domestic sight eased something in his chest, reminding him of peaceful evenings long ago. "Lord," he prayed aloud suddenly, his voice rough with emotion, "grant us wisdom in this time of trial. Show us the path of righteousness and mercy." Hannah's needle never faltered, but a tear slipped down her cheek, catching the lamplight like a star before falling to the mended sleeve in her lap. Outside, an owl called once, lonely in the gathering dark, while inside the cabin, 2 souls waited in faithful silence for God's answer to come. Days stretched into weeks as winter's grip slowly loosened on the Colorado foothills. Inside Isaac's homestead, a gentle routine took shape, as natural as breathing. Hannah rose before dawn, stoking the cook stove until warmth crept through the cabin's chilly rooms. The rhythmic sound of her butter churn became a morning melody, keeping time with the ticking clock on the mantel. Isaac found himself lingering over breakfast, watching her capable hands knead bread dough or darn socks. She hummed hymns while she worked, her voice carrying notes of comfort that reminded him of his mother's kitchen long ago. Sometimes he caught himself humming along. "You've got a fair voice," Hannah remarked one morning, her eyes twinkling as she poured his coffee. "Reminds me of the chapel songs back in Pennsylvania." Isaac ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. "My Emma, she loved singing too." The words slipped out before he could catch them, and his face clouded at the mention of his late wife. Hannah set the coffee pot down gently. "Tell me about her?" she asked, her voice soft as a prayer. Isaac's hands tightened around his cup. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and crackle of the stove. Finally, words came, halting at first, then flowing like spring thaw. "She was hanging laundry that day," he said, his voice rough. "I was mending fences in the south pasture, saw the smoke." He swallowed hard. "Should have been closer. Should have checked the lantern in the barn more careful. My fault she and little John." Hannah's weathered hand covered his. "Isaac," she said firmly, "accidents happen, even to the most careful folks." "But I was proud," he whispered. "Thought I could handle everything myself. Didn't ask for help when the work got too much. If I'd hired that hand from town like Emma wanted." "I lost my Thomas in the war," Hannah shared, her eyes distant. "Union quartermaster shot at Gettysburg. Kept thinking if I'd prayed harder, written more letters." She shook her head. "Then my second husband, William, in the Leadville mines. Cave in. Sometimes the Lord's ways are hard to understand." Every evening after supper, Hannah would open her Bible, its pages worn smooth from years of faithful reading. Her steady voice filled the cabin with ancient words of comfort. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Isaac found himself looking forward to these quiet moments when grief could be shared instead of shouldered alone. Hannah never pressed him to talk, but her presence itself was like a balm, her understanding deeper than words. One mild afternoon, Isaac's prize mare went into labor. Hannah stood beside him in the barn, her experienced hands helping guide the foal into the world. When the spindly-legged creature finally stood, wobbling beneath its mother's watchful eye, Hannah smiled. "Look there," she said softly. "God's promise of new life. Think I'll call her Mercy." Isaac watched the foal nuzzle its mother, something tight in his chest loosening at the sight. "Mercy," he repeated, glancing at Hannah. The name seemed to encompass more than just the new foal. It spoke to the unexpected grace that had entered his life with this remarkable woman's arrival. That night, as Hannah read from Psalms, her voice steady and sure in the lamplight, Isaac realized his home no longer felt haunted by loss. The silence that had oppressed him for 3 years had been replaced by something gentler, the quiet understanding between two souls who had walked through fire and emerged stronger for it. The mare's soft nickering drifted through the window, followed by the foal's answering call. Hannah paused in her reading, and they shared a smile across the warm kitchen. Neither spoke, but both felt it, the subtle shift from strangers bound by circumstance to friends united by shared faith and mutual respect. Later, as Isaac checked the animals one last time before bed, he found himself humming one of Hannah's hymns. The tune carried easily in the night air, and for the first time in years, he felt no guilt in the simple pleasure of song. Perhaps Hannah was right. Mercy could find you even when you weren't looking for it, appearing in the most unexpected forms. Winter mellowed into early spring, bringing longer days and softer breezes to the Colorado foothills. Inside Isaac's homestead, the evening routine had become as familiar as an old hymn. Hannah stood at the iron stove, wooden spoon moving in slow circles through a pot of rabbit stew. Steam carried the rich scent of herbs she'd dried last winter, filling the kitchen with warmth. Isaac sat at the table, mending a bridle strap by lamplight. The leather was stubborn under his fingers, but he worked it patiently, stealing glances at Hannah's back as she cooked. Her gray hair caught the glow of the setting sun through the window, and her humming blended with the bubbling of the pot. "Hannah," he said suddenly, setting down his work. His voice was quiet but certain. "I want to thank you." She turned. Spoon paused mid-stir. "Whatever for?" "For bringing warmth back to this house." Isaac's eyes traced the familiar walls, remembering their cold emptiness before her arrival. These rooms were just shelter before. Now they're... He struggled to find the right words. "They're home again." Hannah shook her head, turning back to the stew. "It's not my doing, Isaac Stoltzfus. It's the Lord who warms, not the fire." Her tone was gentle but firm, brooking no argument. Outside, clouds had been gathering all afternoon, dark and heavy with spring thunder. As evening deepened, the storm drew closer. Lightning flashed across the windows, followed by the low rumble of thunder. Hannah ladled stew into bowls while Isaac lit the evening lamps. A particularly sharp crack of thunder shook the cabin. The force of it rattled the nearest lamp, sending it toppling from its shelf. The glass shattered, and kerosene splashed across the hearth, igniting instantly into hungry flames that licked toward the wooden mantel. Isaac stood frozen, his face draining of color. In his mind's eye, he saw another fire, another night, smoke billowing from the barn, Emma's screams. His legs wouldn't move, his breath caught in his throat like a fist. But Hannah was already moving. She grabbed the heavy wool blanket from her rocking chair, spreading it wide as she approached the flames. With swift, sure movements, she dropped the blanket over the fire, pressing it down firmly to smother the blaze. In moments, the danger was past, leaving only the acrid smell of singed wool and spilled kerosene. When Hannah turned, she found Isaac still rooted to the spot, his whole body trembling. His eyes were wide and unseeing, locked in a moment 3 years past. She crossed to him quickly, taking his work-roughened hand in both of hers. "Isaac," she said firmly, squeezing his fingers until his gaze found her face. "Listen to me now. You are not cursed. Fire does not have the last word." Her voice was strong, brooking no argument. "The Lord gives us trials, yes, but he also gives us the strength to overcome them." Something broke in Isaac then, like ice cracking on a spring river. His shoulders began to shake, and tears, the first he'd shed since the funeral, spilled down his weathered cheeks. Hannah stood steady beside him, her grip on his hand never wavering. "I couldn't save them," he whispered hoarsely. "I tried, but I couldn't." "I know," Hannah murmured. "I know." Slowly she led him to the chairs by the hearth. The storm continued outside, but its fury seemed distant now, separate from the quiet sanctuary of the cabin. Hannah rekindled a small, controlled fire, its warmth gentle and reassuring. They sat together in silence, watching the flames dance behind the grate. Isaac's breathing gradually steadied. His hand remained in Hannah's, drawing comfort from her steady presence. The tears had left him feeling hollow, but it was a clean hollowness, like freshly turned earth ready for planting. Thunder rolled again, softer now, moving east across the prairie. The lamp oil had left a dark stain on the hearthstones, but Hannah would scrub it away tomorrow. For now, they simply sat, Two people who had walked through fire and grief, finding unexpected healing in each other's company. The stew grew cold on the table, forgotten, but neither Isaac nor Hannah moved to retrieve it. Some moments required stillness, and this was one of them. The fire crackled softly in the grate, no longer an enemy, but a reminder that light could overcome darkness, and warmth could return to the coldest places. Morning brought a cheerless dawn, heavy with spring rain that turned the yard to mud. Isaac stood at his window, watching droplets trace down the glass while Hannah prepared breakfast in the kitchen. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh bread couldn't lift the weight settling in his chest as he spotted 3 riders approaching through the murk. Bishop Abram Zook led the small procession, his broad-brimmed hat gleaming wet in the gray light. Behind him rode Elder Miller and Elder Yoder, their faces stern as stone. Their horses' hooves made sucking sounds in the mud as they dismounted and tied their reins to the hitching post. Isaac opened the door before they could knock. "Bishop," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "Elders." Hannah appeared silently at his shoulder, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll fetch more coffee," she murmured, but Bishop Zook held up his hand. "That won't be necessary, Widow Tuttle. This won't take long." His voice was not unkind, but it held the unmistakable authority of one used to being obeyed. "Brother Stoltzfus, we must speak with you, privately." Isaac led them to the barn, where the sweet smell of hay mingled with the earthier scents of horse and cattle. Morning light filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, creating pale stripes in the dusty air. "The rumors are spreading fast," Bishop Zook began, without preamble. "Your arrangement with the widow has become a matter of concern." Elder Miller cleared his throat. "People talk, Isaac. They say improper things about a woman living under your roof, unmarried." "Hannah is a godly woman," Isaac protested, his voice tight. "She needs shelter until—" "Until summer?" Bishop Zook interrupted. "And then what? The community cannot accept this continuing breach of propriety. She must leave before the next Sabbath." Isaac's hands clenched at his sides. "She has nowhere else to go." "Then perhaps she should have thought of that before arriving here uninvited," Elder Yoder said sharply. "That's enough." Bishop Zook's tone softened slightly. "Isaac, we understand your charitable impulses, but your position in the community requires certain sacrifices. The widow must go." They left him standing in the barn, their departure marked by the squelching of hooves in mud and the quiet latching of the gate. Isaac remained there for a long moment, breathing in the familiar sense of his simple life, feeling it all threatening to slip away. When he finally returned to the house, he found Hannah in her room, already folding her few possessions into a worn carpet bag. Her movements were quick and precise, her face composed despite the slight trembling of her hands. "Hannah, wait," he began, but she shook her head. "I heard them through the window," she said quietly, carefully folding her black shawl. "They're right. I should never have stayed this long." "You have every right to be here," Isaac insisted. "I can speak to the bishop again." Hannah turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will not cost you your faith, Isaac Stoltzfus. Your people are your life, your connection to God. I won't be the one to break that." Isaac stood helpless in the doorway, watching as she packed the Bible he'd given her at Christmas, tucking it carefully between layers of clothing. "At least wait until the weather clears," he pleaded. "The stage to Denver runs tomorrow," she replied softly. "I can find domestic work there. I still have skills enough for that." Isaac's throat tightened. Without another word, he grabbed his hat and rode into town. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle, soaking through his coat as he made arrangements at the livery stable to sell 2 of his young calves. The money would be enough for Hannah's fare, and a little extra to help her start over. The day passed in a blur of necessary tasks. Hannah continued packing while Isaac worked in the barn, unable to watch her methodically dismantle the life they'd built together. Only at supper time did they face each other across the table one last time. The meal was simple: bread, cheese, and the last of the winter preserves. Hannah's hands shook slightly as she poured the coffee. "I want to thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain on the roof. "For everything." Isaac couldn't speak. Something was breaking inside him, a pain sharper than anything he'd felt since losing Emma. He nodded once, sharply, and pushed back from the table. That night, sleep eluded him completely. He sat in his chair by the cold hearth, watching the faint glow of Hannah's lamp in the next room through the crack under her door. The light flickered as she moved about, preparing for tomorrow's journey. He remained there until dawn, his mind full of all the words he couldn't say, while outside the rain continued its steady fall. The evening shadow stretched long across the yard when a horrified whinny pierced the quiet. Isaac bolted upright in his chair, recognizing Mercy's distressed call. Hannah was already rushing to the door, pulling on her shawl. "The creek!" she called out, her voice tight with worry. "She must have broken through the ice." They ran through the gathering dusk, their boots crunching on patches of frost. The young mare's dark form thrashed in the water, her eyes wild with panic. She had wandered onto the partially frozen creek, and the thin ice had given way beneath her weight. "Lord have mercy," Hannah breathed, already pulling off her heavy wool shawl. Before Isaac could stop her, she was wading into the freezing water, her skirts billowing around her. "Hannah, no!" Isaac called out, but she was already reaching for the lead rope that still dangled from Mercy's halter. The mare kicked and struggled, sending icy spray everywhere. "Easy, girl," Hannah soothed, her teeth chattering as she worked to calm the frightened animal. Her fingers, red with cold, fumbled with the rope where it had tangled in broken ice. Sharp edges sliced into her palms, but she kept working, blood mixing with the frigid water. Isaac plunged in after her, gasping at the cold. Together they managed to get on either side of the panicked mare. Hannah's face was ghost white, but her voice remained steady as she spoke gentle words to the horse. "We need to guide her toward the bank," Isaac called out over Mercy's frightened sounds. "The ice is thinner here, we can break a path." Hannah nodded, too cold to speak. They worked in desperate synchronization, breaking ice and pulling the mare toward solid ground. Minutes felt like hours in the bone-chilling water. Finally, with a tremendous heave, they guided Mercy onto the bank. The mare scrambled up, trembling but alive. "Hannah!" Isaac turned back just as Hannah's legs gave out. He caught her before she went under, lifting her from the water. Her dress was soaked through, her hands bleeding from the rope cuts. "The barn," she managed through chattering teeth. "Mercy needs to be dried." "You both do," Isaac said firmly, carrying her toward the barn while leading the shivering mare. The lantern he'd grabbed cast jumping shadows as they entered the warmth of the stable. They worked side by side through the night, first rubbing Mercy down with straw and blankets, then walking her to keep her blood flowing. Hannah's hands shook as she applied liniment to the mare's legs, but she refused to rest until the horse was properly tended. Only when Mercy finally dozed on her feet did they allow themselves to sink onto a hay bale. Hannah's dress was still damp, and Isaac draped his coat around her shoulders. In the lantern light, he could see the raw cuts across her palms. "Let me tend those hands," he said softly, reaching for the medical kit he kept for the animals. Hannah didn't resist as he carefully cleaned and wrapped her wounds. "Thank you," Isaac said after a long moment, his voice rough with emotion. "You keep saving what I think is lost." He looked up from her bandaged hands to find her watching him with tired eyes. A weak smile touched Hannah's lips. "You know," she said slowly, "after my second husband died, I prayed for a reason to live again, some purpose to make the days worth walking through." She glanced at Mercy, then back to Isaac. Perhaps I have found it." The lantern flickered, casting warm light across their faces. Something shifted in the air between them, delicate as a butterfly's wing, but strong as steel, wire. Neither spoke of it, but both felt it, a quiet love born of shared purpose and healing hearts. Dawn crept in through the barn slats, painting everything in pale gold. The storm that had threatened yesterday had blown itself out, leaving the world clean and bright. Mercy nickered softly from her stall, fully recovered from her ordeal. They walked back to the house together, their footsteps crunching on frost-covered grass. The morning light streamed through windows that Hannah had washed just days ago, making the simple rooms glow. Everything looked different somehow. Lighter, as if a heavy shadow had lifted. Hannah moved to the stove to start breakfast, her bandaged hands careful but sure. Isaac watched her for a moment, then began to set the table. 2 plates, 2 cups, the rhythm of their shared life continuing despite all that would try to break it apart. Neither spoke of love. Neither needed to. It lived in the quiet moments between words, in the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, in shared glances and gentle hands passing the coffee pot. It was a love built not on passion or romance, but on something deeper, the recognition of 2 souls who had found in each other the healing they thought forever lost. The morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly swept kitchen floor when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Hannah paused in her bread kneading, flour dusting her arms, as Isaac went to greet the postman. "Special delivery from Denver," the rider called out, holding up a cream-colored envelope sealed with the now familiar red wax of the Colorado Matrimonial Agency. Isaac's hands trembled slightly as he opened the letter on the porch. Hannah watched through the window, her heart squeezing tight as his expression changed. He stood there reading for a long moment, his broad shoulders tense beneath his black coat. When he finally came inside, his face was ashen. "It's from the agency," he said quietly, setting the letter on the kitchen table. "They found their mistake. The real Clara Mayfield. She's coming after all." Hannah's fingers stilled in the dough. "When?" The word came out barely above a whisper. "Next week's stage." Isaac wouldn't meet her eyes. "They apologize for the confusion and ask that I prepare for her arrival. She's 19. A seamstress from Ohio." 19, Hannah echoed. She looked down at her own work-worn hands, at the recent scars from the rope that had saved Mercy. That's good, Isaac. A young wife like you wanted." The silence stretched between them, thick as the bread dough on the table. Finally, Hannah wiped her hands on her apron. "I should finish packing my things," she said softly. "I've imposed long enough." "Hannah," Isaac started, but she was already climbing the stairs to the spare room that had become hers these past months. That evening, after Isaac had gone to check the livestock one last time, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with trembling hands and wrote by lamplight. "Dear Isaac, the Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing me to your door that snowy day. Thank you for your kindness to a stranger. I pray your new bride brings the joy and future you deserve. Please don't worry for me. I have lived through harder partings. With gratitude, Hannah." She placed the folded note in the center of the table, where the morning light would find it. Then she gathered her carpet bag, still mostly packed from when she'd first arrived, and slipped out into the night. The moon cast enough light to see by as she walked down the frozen lane. Her breath made clouds in the cold air, and her boots crunched on patches of frost. She had walked many roads alone before, but somehow this one felt the longest. She had only gone about half a mile when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats behind her. Her heart leapt, but she kept walking, clutching her bag closer. "Hannah!" Isaac's voice carried on the night air. "Hannah, wait!" She turned to see him riding bareback on his gelding, having not even taken time to saddle up. He dismounted in a fluid motion and rushed to her, his breath coming in gasps. "You can't leave," he said, reaching for her arm. "Not like this. Not in the dark." "I have to go before she arrives," Hannah said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to stay strong. "It wouldn't be right me being here." "At least stay until then," Isaac pleaded. "Help me prepare. I don't know how to ready the house for a young bride." His words tumbled out, desperate. "Please, stay until she's settled, until I know she's safe here." Hannah looked up at his face, lined with worry in the moonlight. She thought of the young girl coming all this way, barely more than a child herself, and her maternal heart ached. "Very well," she said finally, "until she's settled. But then I must go." Isaac's shoulders sagged with relief. He picked up her carpet bag and offered his arm for the walk back. The gelding followed behind them, his hooves marking time on the frozen ground. They walked in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them like morning mist. Back at the house, Hannah removed her shawl and hung it on its familiar peg. Isaac set her bag by the stairs, neither of them mentioning how soon it would be needed again. "I'll make some tea," Hannah said quietly, moving to the stove where the kettle still held warmth. Isaac sat heavily in his chair, watching as she moved through the familiar routine. 2 cups, 2 spoons, the careful measuring of leaves. The simple domesticity of it made his chest ache. 10 days, he said finally. That's how long we have to prepare. Hannah nodded, not trusting her voice. She set his cup before him and took her own to the chair across the table. Steam rose between them like the ghost of all they couldn't say. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. The sound seemed to echo the hollow feeling in both their hearts as they sat in shared silence, counting the precious days until everything would change. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Isaac stood in the spare room, sunlight streaming through freshly washed windows. His hands gripped a broom handle as if it might steady his racing thoughts. The room had never felt so empty, despite being filled with furniture. He swept methodically, each brush stroke feeling like a betrayal. The bed Hannah had slept in these past months would soon hold a stranger, a girl young enough to be his daughter. The thought made his chest tighten. Hannah's footsteps on the stairs made him pause. She appeared in the doorway carrying fresh linens, her gray hair neat beneath her cap. "I pressed these this morning," she said softly. "The young lady should have clean sheets for her arrival." Together they made the bed, their movements careful and practiced from months of shared work. Hannah tucked hospital corners with skilled hands, while Isaac smoothed the quilt. Neither spoke of how Hannah's own belongings now sat packed in her carpet bag downstairs. In the kitchen, Hannah worked with quiet determination. The familiar scent of baking bread filled the house, a welcome gift for Clara Mayfield. Isaac watched from the doorway as Hannah's hands kneaded the dough, noting how she hummed hymns under her breath. He caught the slight tremor in her voice when she reached certain verses, saw how she blinked back tears while adding more flour. During meals, they sat in their usual places, but the silence between them had changed. It was heavy now, filled with words neither dared speak. Hannah would pause sometimes, fork halfway to her mouth, as if memorizing the simple comfort of their shared table. Isaac found himself studying her face when she wasn't looking. The gentle lines around her eyes, the quiet strength in her bearing. The afternoon sun was lowering when Isaac saddled his horse to ride into town. He needed counsel, and Harvey Dunn had become his most trusted friend outside the faith. He found the English rancher mending tack in his barn. "Harvey," Isaac said, settling onto a hay bale. "I don't know what to do." Harvey set aside his work, studying Isaac's troubled face. "About the young bride coming? Or about Hannah?" "Both." Isaac's voice was rough. "The agency's sending who I asked for, young, able to bear children. It's what's proper. But Hannah—" He trailed off, unable to find words. "Proper ain't always right," Harvey said quietly. "Sometimes the Lord sends us blessings dressed as mistakes. Don't let pride lose what grace brought to your door." Isaac rode home slowly, Harvey's words echoing in his mind. The setting sun painted the foothills in shades of gold and purple, reminding him of evenings watching Hannah tend her small herb garden. How many sunset prayers had they shared, standing apart yet together in their faith? When he reached the homestead, Hannah wasn't in the house. He found her kneeling beside the barn, her face lifted to the darkening sky. Her lips moved in silent prayer, and in the fading light, he saw tears on her cheeks. Without thinking, Isaac knelt beside her in the trampled grass. The evening wind carried the scent of pine and coming frost. Neither spoke. Their shared silence was prayer enough. Hannah's shoulder trembled slightly, and Isaac fought the urge to reach for her hand. The first stars appeared above them, bright pinpoints in the deepening blue. Isaac felt the weight of custom and community pressing down on him, as heavy as his father's Bible. The ordnung was clear about marriage: age, ability to bear children, standing in the community. Hannah met none of these requirements. Yet as they knelt there in the gathering dusk, Isaac knew with sudden clarity that he loved her. Not the dutiful love he'd expected to build with a young bride, but something deeper. A love born of shared grief and healing, of quiet strength and unwavering faith. She had brought light back to his darkened home, warmth to his cold hearth, and peace to his troubled soul. But the knowledge brought no relief. To defy custom would mean facing the bishop's disapproval, perhaps even risking his place in the community. Was he strong enough to choose love over tradition? Could he bear to watch Hannah walk away, knowing he had chosen the safety of custom over the risk of joy? The evening grew colder around them. Finally, Hannah rose, brushing grass from her skirts. "I should check the bread," she murmured, her voice steady despite her tears. Isaac remained kneeling, watching her walk toward the house. Her back was straight, her steps sure, carrying herself with the same quiet dignity she'd shown since that first snowy day. The sight made his heart ache with a pain sweeter and sharper than grief. In the doorway, Hannah paused. Lamplight from within caught her profile, and for a moment she looked like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to speak. Then she went inside, leaving Isaac alone with his troubled thoughts and the gathering night. The morning dawned gray and hushed, snowflakes drifting like whispered prayers. Isaac stood by his wagon, adjusting the horse's harnesses with trembling fingers. The familiar motions felt strange today, weighted with the knowledge of what lay ahead. Hannah stood in the doorway, her shawl pulled tight. "The roads will be slick," she said softly. "Be careful." Isaac nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The space between them seemed vast, though it was only a few steps. He climbed onto the wagon seat, the wood creaking beneath him. As he took up the reins, he glimpsed Hannah's face, lined with age and wisdom, beautiful in its quiet strength. The sight made his heart clench. The journey to town stretched longer than usual. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat brim as the horses plodded through deepening white. Fence posts wore caps of fresh snow, and the winter-bare trees stood like silent witnesses. Isaac's thoughts wandered back to that first snowy day when Hannah had arrived. How different everything had seemed then. Fort Collins Depot gradually emerged through the swirling flakes. A small crowd had gathered, stamping their feet against the cold, eager for the daily entertainment of watching new arrivals. Isaac recognized several faces from his own community, the bishop's wife among them, no doubt there to assess the young bride-to-be. The stagecoach arrived precisely at noon, wheels crunching through fresh snow. Isaac stood straight and tall, his hat in his hands, as the door swung open. A young woman in a blue dress stepped down carefully, her gloved hand accepting the driver's assistance. She couldn't have been more than 21, just as promised. Clara Mayfield, fresh-faced and pretty, exactly what he'd requested in his letter so many months ago. She looked around uncertainly until her gaze found Isaac. A shy smile crossed her face as she approached, her cheeks pink from cold and nerves. "Mr. Stoltzfus?" she asked softly. "Yes," Isaac replied, bowing slightly. "Welcome to Fort Collins, Miss Mayfield." Clara smoothed her blue skirts, glancing at the watching crowd. "I'm so pleased to finally meet you, sir. Your letters were most kind." Isaac took a deep breath, aware of the whispers around them. "Miss Mayfield," he said carefully, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I must speak plainly with you." Her smile faltered slightly. "Sir, I cannot marry you." The words came out clear and firm, carrying across the sudden hush of the depot platform. Clara's eyes widened. I don't understand. Your letters, the agency." "The fault is mine entirely," Isaac said gently. "I cannot marry you because my heart has already made its covenant with another. It would be wrong to proceed, knowing this truth." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "Here is the agency's payment in full, plus extra for your return journey. I've arranged for a room at the hotel until the next stage departs." He handed it to her carefully. "May God bless your path forward, Miss Mayfield, and lead you to the right companion." Clara took the envelope with trembling fingers, tears bright in her eyes. But there was understanding there, too, and perhaps a touch of relief. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Stoltzfus," she whispered. The bishop's wife stepped forward, taking Clara's arm. "Come, child. Let's get you somewhere warm." She shot Isaac a disapproving look, but he stood his ground, watching until they disappeared into the hotel. The drive home seemed both endless and too swift. Snow fell harder now, the flakes large and wet, soaking through his coat. But Isaac barely noticed the cold. His mind was fixed on Hannah, on the warmth of her presence, on the way she'd brought light back into his darkened world. When he finally pushed open his front door, snow melting from his shoulders, he found Hannah by the fire. She sat in her usual chair, her few belongings packed neatly in the carpet bag at her feet. At his entrance, she looked up, her eyes questioning and vulnerable. Isaac stood there dripping, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Hannah's face showed her disbelief, hope warring with uncertainty in her expression. The fire crackled between them, throwing dancing shadows on the walls of the home they'd shared through seasons of healing and quiet joy. The moment stretched, filled with all their unspoken words, all their shared prayers, all the simple meals and daily tasks that had woven their lives together. Isaac felt the weight of custom and expectation fall away, leaving only the truth he'd known in his heart for months. He took a step forward, snow melting from his boots onto the wooden floor, trembling not from cold but from the magnitude of this moment. Hannah's hands stilled in her lap as she gazed up at him, waiting to hear what would come next. The evening shadows lengthened as Isaac saddled his horse, his movements deliberate and sure. Stars were just beginning to peek through the twilight sky as he guided his mount towards the meeting house, its white-painted walls glowing softly in the fading light. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavy on his shoulders, but his heart felt strangely light. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over the simple wooden benches. Bishop Abram Zook and the elders sat in their usual places, their faces solemn as Isaac entered. The creak of his boots on the floorboards seemed loud in the hushed space. "Brothers," Isaac said, removing his hat and standing before them, "I've come to confess my pride." The bishop's eyebrows rose slightly, but he remained silent, waiting. "I thought I knew God's will," Isaac continued, his voice growing stronger. "I believed that following the strictest path would heal my grief. But the Lord sent Hannah to teach me about mercy. True mercy, not just the appearance of righteousness." He drew a deep breath, meeting each man's gaze in turn. "She has shown me courage when I was afraid, faith when mine wavered, and grace when I least deserved it. She is my partner in faith, not my shame." The lamplight flickered across the bishop's weathered face as Isaac spoke. The other elders shifted uncomfortably, but Bishop Zook sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Isaac's face. "I ask for your blessing to marry her," Isaac said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Not because I need it to love her, but because I honor this community and wish to remain faithful to it." Silence filled the meeting house. The elders exchanged glances, their expressions troubled. But Bishop Zook slowly rose from his seat, something like understanding softening his stern features. He nodded just once, but it was enough. Word spread through the settlement like wildfire. By Sunday, the meeting house was full to bursting. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows as Isaac stood before the congregation, Hannah's work-worn hand clasped in his. "Hannah Tuttle," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "Will you join your life to mine as my wife and partner in faith?" Hannah's eyes shone with tears as she looked up at him. Her voice was soft but clear as she answered, "If it pleases the Lord, it pleases me." A murmur of approval rippled through the congregation. Even Bishop Zook's lips curved in a slight smile as he watched them, this unlikely pair who had found love in the winter of their lives. The summer sun painted the Colorado foothills in shades of gold and green. Wildflowers dotted the meadows around Isaac and Hannah's homestead, their bright colors a stark contrast to the weathered barn where scorch marks had finally begun to fade beneath fresh paint. The sound of children's laughter rang across the yard. 6-year-old Mary and 8-year-old Thomas, orphans from the Silver Creek mining camp, chased each other around the garden while Hannah supervised their reading lesson. Her gray hair gleamed in the sunlight as she pointed to verses in her worn Bible, helping 10-year-old Sarah sound out the longer words. "That's right, child," Hannah encouraged, her eyes twinkling. "Take your time with the difficult ones." Near the corral, Isaac showed 14-year-old James how to gentle a nervous colt. His patient voice carried on the warm breeze as he demonstrated proper rope handling. The boy's face glowed with pride when the horse finally accepted his touch. Mrs. Halverson from the general store pulled up in her wagon, bringing a stack of quilts and 2 baskets of preserved fruits. "For the children," she said warmly, no trace remaining of the gossip that had once passed her lips. Other neighbors followed suit, bringing what they could spare for the growing family. As evening approached, Isaac stood on a ladder beside the front door, carefully carving letters into a fresh pine board. Hannah watched from below, admiring how the golden light caught his steady hands. When he finished, the sign read clear and true, "God sends who we need, not who we expect." Later they sat together on the porch, their fingers intertwined. The setting sun painted the mountains in brilliant purple and rose. Crickets began their evening song as stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. "You wanted a young bride," Hannah murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "God sent you an old fool instead." Isaac squeezed her hand gently, his heart full of gratitude. "No," he said softly. "He sent me home. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart."